welcome everyone to the final session. We're just thrilled to have you all. Just such a great group coming across from all sectors and globally. It's phenomenal. My name's Adam Kardash. I'm with the law firm Osler, but with Access Privacy. And as Pat mentioned at the beginning of the session, Access Privacy is one of the co-founders of Channel. And this session is going to focus on what I'll call data protection authority perspectives on what we've heard and just more generally relating to contact tracing. And we have an absolute superb panel. I'm just going to introduce them in the order of which they'll be making some presentations. First, we have Giuseppe Tachisto, who's a senior technology advisor for the Italian DPA, and among other things, represents the DPA within the technology expert subgroup of the European Data Protection Board. And with Giuseppe and the other presenters, just look at their bios. Their bios, I can tell you, don't do them justice. But so please look at the bios for more background on Giuseppe. And of course, Anne Cavoukian, who I'm sure everyone recognizes. She served 3 terms as the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, and currently, among multiple things, which is typical Anne, is the Executive Director of the Global Privacy and Security by Design Center. And as I mentioned, just as we were discussing other things last, but definitely not least, we have Commissioner Jill Clayton, who has served that role since 2012 and is extended at least until 2022 at this point. And great to have all of you join us for this session. It's always so helpful to hear a regulatory authority or former regulatory authority perspective on any issue, and especially something as pressing and timely as urgent as the contact tracing. The format, just for folks, we're going to offer an opportunity for each of the panelists to speak, offer their reflections for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have a bit of time for some Q&A. I'll be monitoring the chat. So I encourage folks, as they're listening, of course, as you've been doing all morning, fire away with that, and we'll do our best to get the questions to the panelists. So just to begin, as I mentioned before, in terms of order, Giuseppe, let me turn to you and share some reflections, perhaps on what you've heard, and even more generally about contact tracing and de-identification.
Yeah. Well, good morning. Thank you, Adam, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation and for the interest in the way we have tackled the COVID emergency here in Europe, where, as you know, the applicable data protection legal framework is the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. Well, I think that this COVID experience has been a sort of stress test of our legislations, and that we have learned many lessons from the implementation of these contact tracing solutions, which I think can be helpful also to keep in mind for similar future situations. First of all, from my perspective, from the perspective of a regulator, so to say a data protection authority, this COVID emergency has pointed out one thing, that the processing of personal data may be extremely helpful for situations of public interest. This is not entirely a new concept, but it's not the mainstream of our work, so to say. And in these cases of public interest, there is always this temptation to say, since there is a general interest, you can do whatever you want with personal data, and data protection is suspended. This is a wrong assumption. There are rules to follow also in exceptional circumstances like this one. And public interest, also the public interest to protect public health, does not mean zero individual safeguards. This is the first lesson that I gather from this experience. Public interest does not mean zero data protection. The most important rule that we have implemented in Europe is that the adoption of contact tracing solutions must always be voluntary, either based on consent or on other legal basis. Self-determination prevails, always prevails, over mandatory adoption. This is a very important starting point. Secondly, we stated that data protection principles are helpful to put in place an effective processing of data in the public interest. In the GDPR, we have an article, Article 5, where the principles are stated. I invite you to go through all those principles and check if we can do without all those principles in this emergency situation. We have transparency, which is a prerequisite for trust, which is necessary to download these contact tracing apps on large scale. We have data minimization, which is there to remove any possible risk of misuse of data for improper classification and stigmatization of the participants in the system. We have fairness, which means inclusion, and translate this concept into the need to put in place applications that are easy to use, compatible with any device and operating system, and also the need to provide assistance to the less digitally educated or impaired part of the population, which are a huge portion of our citizens. Fairness means also reducing the digital divide and also avoiding the creation of a potential and even more discriminatory health divide. Then we have purpose limitation, which is there to guarantee that these solutions are not a sort of electronic ring that controls and enforces our movement. We also have the principles of accuracy, which is very relevant, maybe the most important among principles. If you just imagine what it means to distribute a false positive, or worse, a false negative. This means transforming the app into something else, a sort of anxiety generation tool in the case of false positive, or like completely missing the goal of proactive healthcare. This is just to mention a few examples, which lead me to the conclusion that public interest is fully compatible with data protection principles. And if I may be a little bit provocative, in these and in future similar situations, we should invoke more data protection, not a limitation or a suspension of privacy. This is the first takeaway message. The second aspect that I wanted to highlight is how complex systems like contact tracing solutions. What kind of rules to put in place? My answer to this question is that legal rules are not enough. We also need technological safeguards. Technology may play a very important role to provide safeguards against the intrusiveness of technology itself. So technology is safeguards against technology. We have this concept of privacy by design, well known. I don't have to explain to you what privacy by design is, but this is now in the law. It's very important. It's an obligation for controllers. The GDPR says, let me quote the wording, that data protection by design is a way to integrate safeguards into the processing and to implement data protection principles in an effective way. So this technology is a way to be effective in the implementation of rules. And it's a huge opportunity. But we need to understand very well the type of safeguards that technology can bring. There are many possibilities, but we have to be clear and to avoid any misunderstanding, and we have to demystify some, let's say, misunderstanding on this concept. In the context of fight against coronavirus, anonymization is an interesting option and may have many applications. To react to a question asked by Khaled in the chat, for instance, anonymization may play a very interesting role in research, and it is always an alternative to the deletion of data. And this is the position that we have taken in Europe, also very recently, with the statements made by the European Data Protection Board. But we should be clear on what we mean when we talk about anonymization. In Europe, we refer to anonymization as a set of techniques that are needed when we want to remove the ability to link the data with an identified or identifiable person against any reasonable effort. This is the concept that we have in the law. The reasonability of the effort to re-identify an individual. And this is a risk-based approach, risk-based criterion. It's not just the identification. Anonymization implies the identification and maybe also unintelligibility of data. But the reverse is not true. The identification or encryption do not imply anonymization. And this complicates a lot the discussion. Data cannot be anonymized one by one. This is very important, crucial. Only data sets as a whole may be made anonymous. In this sense, any intervention on single data or single patterns by means of encryption or any other mathematical or probabilistic transformation can be considered just a pseudonymization of data. The EDPB has provided guidance on this criteria to follow for good anonymization. There is an opinion which is dated back 2014, where we have stated that in order to have a good anonymization, we should not have any single out of individual records in a data set, no possibility to link two keys into different data sets, and very limited possibility, of course, depending on the context and on the purpose, to make easy inference on the identities or hidden attributes. These are the prerequisites, the necessary conditions for anonymization. Not sufficient, just necessary. Pseudonymization is a different concept, and it's a different way to integrate safeguards into the processing. The GDPR refers to it as a processing of personal data in a manner such that the personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific individual without the use of any additional information, provided this is the text of the law, provided that such additional information is kept separately and is subject to appropriate technical and organizational security measures. This fits very much with this context that we have with contact tracing solutions, since the purpose of these apps is to distribute identifiers of positive individuals, positive person, which is the result of a pseudonymization, by the way, to check whether these individuals are among our contacts, but not a broadcast of the code, of the keys to the code, the identities. This is exactly the definition of pseudonymization. Pseudonymization does not eliminate the possibility to re-identify individuals, which may be even necessary and functional for the correct functioning of these apps. And also there may be, but it doesn't reduce or let's say nullifies the possibility to re-identify data subjects, because there are many contextual factors that can make a re-identification possible. Think of the case where I'm familiar with a positive person, or think of the case where the contact was a sort of exceptional event in a sequence of repetitive behaviors. These contextual circumstances make the re-identification possible, even if data have been pseudonymized. The EDPB just yesterday has adopted a statement on interoperability, which is going to be made public in the website of the EDPB, where we have clarified the meaning and the safeguard of pseudonymization in the context of contact tracing applications. Now, in a nutshell and in conclusion, we have a lot of technical possibilities to provide safeguards, but we must be very careful on how we handle these possibilities. Technologies, I think, can only increase the complexity of processing operations. Contact tracing is just an example. It's a sort of anticipation of the futures. Things can only become more complex than this. Now, providing safeguards in these complex environments will become harder and harder over time. And there is no simple answer to complex questions. Many, let's say, detractors of privacy by design argue that this is a difficult option. Maybe it's true. Maybe privacy by design, it's difficult. But we should not be scared by difficult tasks. There's huge literature. There's huge experience. We have consolidated scientific results. We have experts. Khaled is one of the worldwide recognized experts on this. And if it is difficult to make good pseudonymization, a good anonymization, well, believe me, it's very easy and simple to get bad or very bad outcomes with no safeguards for individuals. I think that this is the lesson of this contact tracing experience that we are living. We must bear the cost of complexity. It's an important societal responsibility. If we do not do so, and we buy easy, maybe sometimes very easy or simplistic solutions for complex problems, we end up providing just fictional safeguards. And at the end of the day, we limit our capabilities to regulate complex technological phenomena like this one that we are discussing today. This, I think, is the real challenge and heritage of this COVID situation, beyond contingency, beyond the very fact that this is needed to, let's say, help us to get out of the pandemics as soon as possible. I think that we have to look forward after this emergency is over. And I think this is the real heritage that we have to bring from this situation. Thanks.
Giuseppe, thanks. And of course, it's a natural segue because to address the challenges that you've articulated, you've mentioned several times, including right towards the conclusion, privacy by design is a key component. So we naturally segue to Anne Cavoukian. So Anne, I turn it over to you for a comment.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Giuseppe. Thank you. And there's no question, privacy by design is not easy. It's something you have to proactively embed into your operations in an effort to prevent the privacy harms from arising. And nowhere is this more necessary in the contact tracing apps that are being developed. And I'm not going to talk about in particular, I will talk about the Apple-Google framework simply because, first of all, I never take anything on face value, trust but verify. Apple has, on 2 separate occasions, walked me through all of the details underneath the app and how it does not collect any personal information, no geolocation data, nothing. It's as close to privacy protective as you're going to get. And the reason I think this kind of approach is absolutely essential is because there is such a trust deficit now. Oh my God, there is so little trust out there, and I understand why. First of all, one of the essentials of privacy by design, in addition to being proactive, and I'll talk about privacy as the default in a moment, but one of the essentials is abandon zero-sum models, by which I mean it can't be one interest versus another. Increase in public safety, we need public safety, so forget about privacy, and the two total to a sum of zero. This is what cannot be contemplated, because once you have this either or win-lose phenomenon, privacy always goes out the door. And I'm not suggesting that public safety should go out the door, but you cannot have one versus the other. You must have 2 positive gains, multiple gains in this area. It has to be public safety and privacy, because if you don't combine them, you're not going to have, in my view, either one grow. There was a study done about a survey 2 weeks ago. I'm going to read 2 things from it. First of all, only 54%, this is in Canada, 54% of people said they would likely be willing to download a contact tracing app. So it's not bad, it's approaching 60%. But they said more than 3/4 of people said they expected to be at increased risk of mass surveillance. This is the huge threat. And contact tracing apps, 88% of people, 88% worried that their information would end up in the hands of multiple parties after the pandemic. And this is what concerns me so much. With that much concern, that much fear, and fear that the information, once the pandemic is over, because it will end, that this information will continue to be used and collected. That is the huge concern we have to overcome. And governments have to speak up on this, and privacy commissioners have to oversee sunset clauses that governments have to introduce in order to engage in the emergency powers that enable it to collect far more information than privacy laws would permit. They have to have firm sunset clauses with firm end dates. And once that happens, all the data collected thus far has to be deleted. Are we hearing anything about that? We're not, because the fear is that this information and the data collection will continue well after the pandemic ends. I do media interviews every day, and I've never had so many media requests for this story. Every single day, I'm not kidding, I get 1 to 3 media interview requests, and I always do them because I want to put out what the concerns are in terms of privacy, that the pandemic cannot bring an end to our privacy. Oh my God, yes, public safety is important, but privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. You're not going to have that end at the end of the pandemic, or continue after the pandemic. This is absolutely critical, and this is the messaging I try to get across, that we have to find a way to ensure that privacy will be strongly preserved well after the pandemic. And public safety, of course, is very important, but public health authorities have to understand that the kind of contact tracing app developed by Apple, Google, for example, that is highly privacy protective, that is intended to work along with manual contact tracing, which will continue, which public health authorities have been doing, of course, for a long time, and that this will complement that so that you can have the widest number of protections. Trust is absolutely critical. And right now, there's so little of it. I have a large Twitter following, and I tweet every morning between 5:30 and 6 a.m. And I have never had so many responses back along these lines saying, you know, lady, get over it. That ship has sailed, privacy. You know, forget it. And I say, are you kidding me? Get another ship. What do you mean that ship has sailed? Don't be ridiculous. Just because it's difficult to do doesn't mean we don't do it. That's what privacy by design is all about. It's about preserving them. I'll make one more comment. In one of my media interviews I do, there's this radio station in the US with a huge following, like millions of people. And I've been on this particular station a number of times in the past doing stories on privacy. And it's a very respectful crowd. You know, I get some questions afterwards, but usually very nice comments and things of that nature. I did a story on the contact tracing apps, and I was applauding Apple, Google for protecting privacy and preserving the information. I could not believe the responses I got afterwards. I mean, people were saying, lady, are you kidding me? You want me to use this app? You expect me to trust this? Forget about it. You've lost it. I couldn't believe it because I know they view me, generally speaking, as a respected privacy person, but they thought in me telling them to engage the use of this contact tracing app, that was it. I was off their books because the fear of being surveilled, having this information tracked afterwards, potential COVID-19 positive status, for example, they are so fearful that in the hands of their employers or various other parties, this is going to cause them a lot of harm. And I want to be clear. People are often very distrustful of the private sector. I would urge you to be equally distrustful of the public sector. When I was privacy commissioners for 3 terms, in each term, there was a different political party that formed the government. And before they had formed the government, they were all for privacy. We want to protect people's privacy rights, etc. Once they became the government, the dialogue changed. All of a sudden, they wanted control over the data. So please, be not disrespectful, but question both public and private sector. We need to have our privacy preserved across the board. And when the pandemic ends, and it will, we have to make sure that our privacy is preserved now and well into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll turn to the beautiful province of Alberta. Commissioner Clayton, turn to you.
The cold and rainy and windy city of Edmonton. Yes. Well, first of all, thanks very, very much for the invitation. And I really enjoyed listening to the earlier speakers, but also Anne and Giuseppe on this panel. Like Giuseppe opened by saying, you know, these are strange and unprecedented times. And I think we're finding that as well. The world has turned upside down and all over the place, and the kinds of work that we're doing right at the moment looks a little bit different to what we were doing, say, earlier this year, January or so. Anyway, I think as a regulator, we've had to get up to speed quite quickly on a lot of new initiatives and new technologies. And like other regulators, we find we're issuing all sorts of guidance on topics that, again, 3 or 4 months ago, we probably weren't going to, weren't on our list of things to go out with guidance on. So to Anne's point, though, about, it's not a zero-sum game, and you can't, public health and privacy are not mutually exclusive. I think, like a lot of regulators, we opened the pandemic by reminding people that we published some information on our website about how information can be shared under Alberta's privacy laws and what provisions the regulated bodies needed to be looking for. And again, trying to point out privacy laws are not a barrier to information sharing or to public health. But you need to know what the rules are. The rules are not out the window just because we're in this time where there's this sense of urgency and the pandemic or an emergency situation. And Giuseppe made that point also, and I just wanted to, as part of sort of setting some context before I talk a little bit about where we're at in Alberta with contact tracing. And one of the second guidance documents we put out had to do with privacy impact assessments. So I think many people across Canada anyway, if you have any familiarity with Alberta's Health Information Act, will know that privacy impact assessments must be submitted to me. It's a legal requirement that I get a privacy impact assessment for these sorts of new initiatives that affect how health information is collected, used, or disclosed. It must be submitted before the new initiative is launched. Doesn't say how long before. Ideally, we would have it in advance, lots of time to review it and to go through a normal process, which is back and forth, lots of questions. And then, of course, what we have found during the time of the pandemic, in the health sector in particular, lots of virtual care apps, for example. The government and the Chief Medical Officer of Health is telling people, don't go to emergency clinics, don't go see your doctor, look into virtual health solutions. And I know all kinds of people who love being able to connect with their doctor in the same way that we're having this conference, right? So we saw, I think maybe in the first couple of weeks, we saw all kinds of virtual care apps, well over 200 came in almost immediately. And again, we published a notice on our website to say, again, to Giuseppe's point, the laws are not suspended. The laws work. They're flexible. They work in this pandemic environment, in this urgent environment. I get that you might not be able to do the full-blown privacy impact assessment, but you need to at least tell me what you are doing, and we will follow up with you. And certainly we'll triage a little bit here. And so there's certain kinds of new initiatives, apps, for example, that we are looking at more closely than others because of the urgency. But we at least, I have no ability to say that the requirement to submit a PIA is suspended. That's not my job, and I don't want that. I think that having to look at safeguards and think about any new technology that you're going to implement, privacy can only help you make sure that is robust and that individuals are protected. So So that's the underlying legislative context. A privacy impact assessment must come into my office. I've said at least notify me about what's going on. I think I will also point out that our Health Information Act, to the point of this whole conference, Section 57 of the Health Information Act requires custodians to use aggregate data if aggregate data will allow them to meet their purpose. And failing that, to consider using non-identifying, that's the language in the legislation, use non-identifying health information to meet their purpose. So, so I think those are a couple of key things to remember about Alberta's legislation. So that was kind of the situation early April. We'd issued some guidance on a few other topics that aren't really related here, but generally said privacy laws still apply. I still want to see privacy impact assessments. If you can't give me the whole thing before you start seeing your patients virtually, tell me what you're doing, show me what safeguards you've got in place. We've published some other guidance to, here are the things that you need to be looking at. Show me you've turned your attention to that sort of thing. So around that time, we also heard some public rumblings from the government about contact tracing app, and we did receive contact from Alberta Health here saying we're looking at a contact tracing app. And after that first public announcement, so we got a heads up and a bit of a briefing, really high level. And then there was a government announcement that we were going to introduce this contact tracing app. And so I put out a statement saying some of the things that we need to see here. Well, first of all, I want the PIA, and I already knew I was getting one because of the high level briefing, but also saying, it's important to build public trust, which is a real theme here in the session today. It needs to be really clear, easy to understand. Albertans need to understand the privacy practices. I want to know, and Albertans need to know what information is going to be collected, how it's going to be used, in what circumstances, what information is going to be retained, how long is it going to be retained, and what happens to all of this when the pandemic is over. So short statement, a couple of key points. Almost immediately after that, we did get the actual privacy impact assessment. So it came in advance of the launch on May 1st by a couple of days. Again, not ideal, meets the legislative requirements. We'd like a lot more time to go back and forth on this, and that's what we have been doing. We almost immediately had a whole bunch of questions that we put out to Alberta Health. But again, after they launched, I want Albertans to understand that there is some oversight here through the privacy impact assessment process, and there are other ways, but that's pretty key. And one of the things that I think Albertans should be really pleased about, that there is a legal requirement. This thing has to come to me, and I have spoken publicly about it. I issued another statement on May 1st, actually, the day that they announced it, saying again, I do support efforts to look at contact tracing processes, but to points that have been made by Anne, by Teresa Scaza earlier, you have to be really clear about what the objective here is. And you have to make sure that that's what you're communicating to people. And trust means that if you say you're communicating or that you're using this contact tracing app for a particular purpose, that's actually what you're going to stick to. And I think also being very open and transparent about what the limitations are is really important. So this idea that if Alberta introduces a contact tracing app, that we're going to open the economy earlier and we're going to get rid of coronavirus in Alberta and everybody will be able to go back to normal is that's just not on, right? Technology is, as I said in the statement, technology is not a panacea here. It's not going to eradicate coronavirus from the province. But one of the things I said in that statement, and again, I can't really get into a whole lot of details of the app because we are in that process, getting pretty close to the end of our review of that app, and I will be commenting publicly on that when we get there. But certainly some of the early things I can comment on because this was very, very public. One of the things that we've looked at these contact tracing apps all around the world, and from the earlier speakers at this conference, you can see that apps come in all kinds of shapes and models, and they're voluntary and not voluntary and decentralized and centralized, and there's hybrid versions, and they collect this amount of information or just a little bit of information. Some of these are very intrusive apps, And in my view, what Alberta Health has gone forward with, what the government has gone forward with, is one of the least intrusive apps. And they've been quite specific that this is not about replacing contact tracing, and this is not about opening the economy and saving Albertans from the virus. This is an app that will assist the existing public health contact tracing process. So if somebody comes to you and says, or you test positive, and someone says, okay, well, tell me everywhere you've been in the last 3 weeks and everybody you may have come in contact with. I know if you ask me that, I can't remember who I came into contact with this morning. So being able to have an encounter log that has been tracking for a set period of time would really assist me. And that's information I could choose to give to Alberta Health and to the public health officials who will actually carry on their regular process. That's the way this app is designed. We'll call people and we'll talk to them about what the information, what information they have. They can, it's a voluntary app, so you choose to download it. And then if you test positive, you choose to share your encounter log or not. So if you do, then that is the information that the public health officials use to contact somebody and say, you know, and you were exposed on a particular date, and they'll have some information. The human intervention in that, I think, helps to get at advice and recommendations, but also ensure accuracy and provide information to individuals about what this actually means that they may have been exposed. So that's one of the things that I thought was a less intrusive approach. It's a narrow scope. The objectives are quite narrow. It is voluntary. Registering for it collects minimal information. It's your phone number. We've certainly seen apps that collect a wide variety of data elements about individuals. It's a decentralized storage of de-identified Bluetooth contact logs on your phone. It doesn't go to anybody in Alberta Health or in government until you decide that you want to do that. So those are good things. We did get the privacy impact assessment. We had early conversations with Alberta Health about making that public, and I was flying off the Alberta privacy impact, or sorry, the Australian privacy impact assessment. Whenever I see a published privacy impact assessment, we're sharing it to make the point that you know, transparency is really important here. And Alberta Health has committed to sharing their privacy impact assessment. It's changed a lot through the process of our ongoing review, a lot of back and forth. I know we're short on time. I just want to say this doesn't mean that I don't have any concerns. I have lots of questions. We have provided lots of questions. I will say my top concerns have to do with secondary uses. I want to know that the information is not going to be used for things like quarantine enforcement, or that employers aren't going to get this information, and on and on and on. There's discussion plans. I know the idea is to use de-identified information for analytics purposes. They've been open about that, but I really do want to understand what that means. How are we de-identifying the information? What kind of guarantees are there that it can't be reverse engineered, that people won't be identified? So that's super key. And then of course there is some, I know a lot of speakers have talked already about the running the app on the foreground of your Apple device. And I have some pretty significant concerns about that. I know they've been in touch with Apple. I don't know yet what the solution to that is, but yeah, I definitely have some concerns about that. And some other things, of course. As I said, we have committed to being public about our review, which is why we've issued some statements so far. We've had really good response from Alberta Health on that. And we will carry on monitoring also. I think that is super important. This idea that what is success of this app, what are we trying to achieve, and has it been successful? That those are really key, and we'll be following up on that.
Thank you. We're out of time, but there are a number of questions. There is one question I do want to pick up on. It's a superb question that Fred Carter has asked that really seems to highlight one of the lessons learned by this particular use case, which is that stakeholder discussion engagement, multi-stakeholder discussion engagement is so critically important for sort of complex systems, and certainly systems that have data processing that could have broad impact, and contact tracing is exactly that. Commissioner Clayton, I'm going to go to you first on this, because the question, and I'm going to scroll up just to get it. The question is, can a regulator participate in the design of the app? And in your case, you have a statutory regime where there's a mandated PIA process, but can you still participate and still be neutral? And I think the subtext or the implicit part of that question is that in order to have trust, it's the independence and regulatory oversight. Yet at the same time, it's acknowledged that stakeholder engagement, especially from thoughtful and experienced stakeholders like a privacy regulatory authority, whatever jurisdiction, would be helpful. So I do recognize that we could spend 3 hours discussing this. Like, I think it's a critical point. Just if we could start with you, and then I want to turn also to former Commissioner Cavoukian and also Giuseppe for comments on that. And if it's possible to do it in like 90 seconds, 2 minutes a pop, would be phenomenal.
Okay, really short. We have this legislative requirement to submit the PIA. I am not out there endorsing any particular app. That's not my business. It's not my business to cheerlead for this app or to try and get Albertans to sign up on it. My job is to be an independent viewer, regulator of this app, and to say either we think that they have met their requirements under the Health Information Act, or they have not, that it's compliant or it's not. We don't approve, and we're quite particular about this language. We don't approve PIAs, but we will accept them and say that this means that at this point in time, when we've looked at it, we are satisfied they have met the requirements of the legislation. They have turned their mind to privacy and security, and they have taken steps to mitigate risk. So that's what I can offer Albertans, is we've looked at this thing and we've accepted the PIA, or we haven't accepted the PIA, or we've made recommendations. So it is an independent voice that Albertans can hopefully rely on as they make a choice about whether or not they want to download this app. They make a choice about whether they want to share their encounter logs. They make a choice about whether they want to participate in this.
And
look, governments need help. I want to be very clear. I remember during my terms as commissioner, governments consulted with us on numerous occasions, and we were always happy to offer our assistance. So I think not to offer your assistance and guidance because you want to be squeaky clean later on when you evaluate, I think that's the wrong approach. What you can set out very clearly is what are the basics, the essentials that you expect here in terms of protecting privacy. No access to identifiable data, no access to geolocation data. I mean, we could go through the list. So offering that kind of assistance, that's what privacy by design is all about. Being upfront, you don't hold back. You offer whatever assistance you can in terms of what would be the most privacy preserving solutions that you could offer and assist public health authorities. These are complicated matters. So I would always err, if you will, on the side of providing assistance upfront. Life is short, you know, just put the brakes on it so you can be purely pristine and clear afterwards to assess it. I think that's the wrong way to go.
Giuseppe. Oh, I'm sorry, Giuseppe, we can't hear you.
I was saying that regulators have a very important responsibility because they have the first and the last words on the development of these apps. They must arrive beforehand, upfront, giving clear rules in advance, not derogate from those rules, give assistance in clarifying what they meant when they issued those rules, and they have the responsibility to say the last words before they are launched. This is what happened in Europe. The rules of the European Data Protection Board were issued immediately after Easter. It was the 14th and the 19th of April. And the first apps have been launched last week. And luckily enough, the development in Europe has been done in compliance with those rules. So we had a very important role of responsibility there. It's not an active participation in the development, but we are there. So a regulator, the role of regulator is watch over the development of good solutions.
Well, we could go on forever. Thank you so much. We're out of time. So thank you, Commissioner Clayton, Giuseppe D'Acquisto, and Cavoukian, as expected, and of course, as advertised, very thoughtful and helpful comments. I'm going to end just with a couple of comments, really where Pat Kosseim began. What's Canon's purpose? Our purpose is to promote de-identification and other privacy-enhancing technologies as a respectful, privacy-respectful means to support innovation and leverage data for societal and economic good, economic purposes. And the ultimate objective is to create a framework and to help achieve this. It's an ambitious goal. And what we realized with the contact tracing is a couple of things, and it came up thematically earlier in the morning and then also in this discussion. There was two things. One is we need to help demystify, because if we have mystification, we have uncertainty, we don't have trust, and then you have reticence to move forward on really important things. And the second thing is we desperately need a use case before you can develop framework. This is the most timely and not timely, urgent use case. And so many lessons learned, including that last question that was asked about lessons learned about the necessity for just helpful, engaged dialogue to achieve these things. So again, thank you so much for participating. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we were just thrilled about the attendees, and thank you for all attending, folks all around the world, from sectors, public, private, governmental, broader public sector. It was just it's a helpful validation of the critical need for just to focus on de-identification challenge. And in Canada, we're now up for it with Canon. We really encourage folks who have listened in to please get actively involved. We welcome all input. We were thrilled. We got Canon received funding through the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada's Research Contributions Program, and we're just about to kick that off in terms of exploring more use cases, helping demystify, all with the view of moving towards a framework and developing a community of engagement and a practice. So again, anyone interested in involving, we welcome you. Go to the Canon website at deidentify.ca. And with that, I'll say goodbye and thank you, everyone. Everyone be safe, be well, and we'll hopefully speak to you all soon. Thank you very much.